And a couple things that I think are essential to being integral, if you will, is the acceptance of the idea of evolution, not just in the exteriors, not just in terms of atoms to molecules to cells and so forth, but evolution in the interiors, that there's an evolution of consciousness, human consciousness, and actually plant and animal consciousness and atomic consciousness that is evolving. And that there is an evolution that is apparent in culture, which is also sort of the shared collective interior. And that realization of the evolution of the interiors and basically a realization of the fact that one is riding an updraft of emergence in one's own life, and so is one's culture. And that's a sort of a capital R realization, that it sort of evokes just a general friendliness to all stages, because you realize that all stages were supposed to be there, and that an 8-year-old is not a defective 12-year-old, and so forth. And you become what Claire Graves called, one of the original researchers, the universal donor. That is the person that can relate to all. And you know, that's a development, that's a line of development in and of itself. But you have to sort of be consciously on that project to be in the integral space as I define it. So another one is, and there's only two, is that you have to sort of understand, and this is part of, I guess, even these interiors, but the spiritual dimension of reality, that mind is not reducible to brain, that there is a non-material reality, that there is a loving intelligence that animates the universe, and which may pre-exist the Big Bang, and it may pre-exist in our life. We may be coming in streaming trails of karma, and we may survive this life in further development. And that, that sort of space within which time and space arise is real, and it's intelligent and loving, and that there's a eros that wants to grow out of it, and there's an agape that wants to rain down from it. And so, again, a line of development in and of itself. But, there are a lot of people who don't buy into one or the other of those two things, this evolution in the interior and this spiritual dimension. And, I'm happy for anybody to be drawn to integral theory and, think whatever they want, because that's how evolution itself works. And in fact, many of my favorite intellectuals, I wouldn't consider to be integral for these reasons. So Sam Harris, a materialist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, certainly, even Steven Pinker, who, is one of my heroes. His book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is a brilliant exposition of the unfolding of goodness, truth, and beauty in history. But he does not acknowledge a spiritual dimension, or the idea of free will or any of that. And there are people in the integral world that don't either. And I'm certainly not excluding them. I'm just telling what really does it for me. I thought, speaking of in the integral world, there's a website that many of you know called Integral World, run by Frank Visser, and very critical of Ken, and very much into the pointing out the hubris of the integral world and the mistakes of the integral world. And I've interviewed Frank, and he's a great guy, and really smart. And we kind of just came down to the sort of agreement that, in my world, I sort of accept this spiritual dimension of reality, and he really doesn't. And so that is, that colors a lot. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there as, how I think about integral. As for the spiritual geniuses, I think integral helps us to understand how this works too. We have the Buddha and Lao Tzu and Jesus, and, certainly these people and many more spiked into integral territory and beyond, way beyond, in the sense of waking up, in the sense of this realization of oneness, or the Godhead, or this space within which this world arises, and the realization that this world is not my home, and that I have a reality and I have an identity that is bigger than this, and I'm going somewhere, or something like that. Fullness, emptiness. There's all kinds of sort of poetic ways of pointing to that. And these people realize that, talk about a capital R realization, big time. And but none of them, at least these ones we're talking about here, the axial geniuses of the axial age, 2,000 plus years ago, and really all historical people who had realizations, they didn't have an understanding of evolution. That's not a criticism. That's just reality. The Buddha saw the world as an endless wheel of suffering. And what we integralists realize that it's an endless spiral of suffering. It's a, evolving catastrophe, but it is an evolving catastrophe and evolving towards goodness, truth, and beauty. And, the Buddha didn't realize this explicitly. I think there's a lot of implicit understanding of that in the doctrine, but that's another topic. These guys were products of their time. And this is a distinction that Ken Wilber makes that I think is a brilliant one. And that's the idea of waking up, or this idea where these folks were geniuses, this realization of the spiritual reality and our true nature and all of that good stuff. And then the idea of growing up, or moving into the next higher stage of your own or your culture's development. And, if you think about even Jesus, now Jesus, and all of these guys were, definitely pushing the edge of the development of their cultures. I mean, if you think of what Jesus did, he widened the circle of who could be saved beyond Jews. Go out and preach to all the world and the Gentiles, and that was new. And there's a lot of theory about that cracked the code into modernity. This idea of an individual salvation, and it's available to everybody, and everybody's equal in salvation, and that's amazing. Not only waking up but growing up. But Jesus was also good with a vengeful God. He was good with smiting the unbelievers, and he was all in on hell and damnation, and that's okay. But we could have the realization that he had on the spiritual dimension and on the waking up side, and have a higher realization on the growing up side now, and it's more to come. But this is the nature of evolution. I think of a card that somebody sent me. It's one of my favorite cards. It shows Jesus. It's sort of a classic image, sort of Sunday school image of Sunday school Jesus, white Jesus, with the sort of sun-kissed hair and his white robe. And he's leaning up against the door, and he's knocking on the door. And he's saying, "Open the door and let me in." You can see that there's a thought bubble. And coming from inside the door is, "Why?" And Jesus's answer is, "So I can save you from what I'm going to do to you if you don't open the door and let me in." So there's a certain something about that I liked. So there has to be a, sort of a 4-quadrant or a fuller quadrant move into these new territories to be able to sort of start identifying them as being, traditional or modern or postmodern or integral. You got to get, most of yourself up into one or the other. We talk about development is a probability cloud. And, somebody who we would say is at modern would have 25% of their responses would be postmodern, 25% would be pre-modern, and 50%, there's that kind of thing. And that's true of cultures too. And it's a crazy, evolution's crazy. I mean, the way people spike into genius on these various lines, like the spiritual line, but there's also the cognitive line, there's the scientific line, there's the, emotional line, there's all artistic, there's many lines of development and all kinds of different models for what those lines are. But, there are, we talk about Greece, for instance, as being proto-modern. And they were, in the sense that the Greeks were doing, sophisticated mathematics, philosophy, very modern in that cognitive line. But they owned slaves, they were pedophilia, the rape, there was Greece and Rome as well were brutal cultures in many ways. And that actually survives. I mean, we think up to the Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. We think of, it's Thomas Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is a seminal doctrine of modern philosophy and politics. Was he modern? Well, not in the sense that he was still good with owning slaves. And he had sort of an agrarian soul, that was so, this is part of the messiness of evolution, especially as we get into the territories where we're at now, where there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 stages online at the same time, not only in the culture, but within each of us. You know, and we can feel them all, and we can still find our center of gravity.